Welcome to today's British Council Global New Directions webinar, Designing Inclusive Assessments, Policies, and Best Practices. Please note that this session will be recorded and the link will be shared after the webinar. Use the Q&A button that's at the top of the screen for questions, and please upvote the questions of interest to you. Presentation slides will be sent to participants via email, and attendance certificates will be available after completing the post-webinar survey, which will be available via a link and shared in the chat at the end of the session. This webinar is the second of a trilogy of EDI and assessment-themed webinars. The first webinar was focused on legislation and policy primarily and was in October. It's now online on YouTube if you want to catch up on it later. We'll also drop a link into the chat so you can save it. Today's webinar is focused more on inclusive test content as well as test design. And the third webinar of the trilogy will be focused on accessibility and test accommodations. And this one will be in February, so stay tuned for the date and registration link. And now to introduce our webinar speakers today. Unfortunately, my colleague Damon Young, who is the EDI researcher at the British Council, is not able to join us today. He sends his apologies, so I will be presenting his section a bit later on his behalf. I'm Gemma Bellhouse, and I manage the quality assurance team within the British Council. And my team manages the EDI policies and EDI compliance of the British Council exams like Aptis and primary English tests. I also chair the EDI Special Interest Group for EALTA, the European Association for Language Testing and Assessment. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Nahal Khabbazbashi, who is our guest speaker today. Nahal is an Associate Professor of Language Assessment at the Centre for Research in English Language Learning and Assessment, that's CRELA, at the University of Bedfordshire. Her research focuses on advancing fairness and equity in high-stakes language testing. Nahal is also the chair of the BALL Testing, Evaluation and Assessment Special Interest Group. Thank you so much, Nahal, for joining us. And now over to you as the participants. This is the data that came out of the registration form for the webinar. Your roles range from teachers to school managers, students, authors, and business development colleagues. You can also see the top 10 countries with Romania, Mexico, and Myanmar with the highest registrations today. I'll now go over today's webinar session aims. Firstly, I will introduce the fundamental concepts of inclusive test design. Next, I'll briefly introduce inclusive test design policy at the British Council, after which Nahal will give us a deep dive overview of her research of content representation. I will then describe 2 case studies considering test takers' views of diversifying accent inclusion within assessment. And next, we will go deeper into test design and test content and ways to consider diversifying assessment in the classroom. And at the end, we will have some time for open questions. Please do use the Q&A to add your questions throughout the webinar, and we will end with key takeaways. So let's begin with defining inclusive test design. The sociocognitive framework presented on the right may already be familiar to you. This is the sociocognitive framework or approach, and the version from the publication in 2020 by Barry O'Sullivan, our Director of Research at the British Council, and Micheline Chalhoub-Deville, an expert in language testing. The sociocognitive model, as pictured here, puts the test taker at the center of the test design process, which is foundational for understanding inclusive test design. If we take account of individual characteristics and diverse needs from the beginning, and also context of test use, test design will be more inclusive and accessible to all test takers. This sociocognitive model is meant to represent test validity beyond the test score, as the stakeholders, including the test takers, teachers, and others, are important, and investigating the test consequences is important also to understand whether the test is fit for purpose and valid for its usage. So the communication with test takers and their feedback should be continually gathered, inspected, and implemented to improve the test experience. But what does inclusive test design really involve, though? And what are the practical things we can do as educators? Well, as I just said, ideally test designers embed inclusive principles at the beginning of test design, and then these inclusive principles and perspectives are relevant also for ongoing test production and test delivery. And by analyzing the consequences of the test and conducting research with our test takers and language learners, we can make improvements and better communicate with the stakeholders. Four inclusive design aspects are named here on the slide, including inclusivity within test specifications. So that means decisions when it comes to the task design and also the entire test. For example, if the components are individual, speaking, listening, reading, writing, then when test takers do not or cannot take one of them, it is easy to simply remove that skill. Then, considering accessibility of the format of the test, especially when it is online and computer-based, some functionality can be built in and can provide more accessibility for test takers, while some functionality will be better for some test takers offline. Then we consider test taker representation for test use, as test takers should be able to relate to the content and then be using the language for their target use beyond the test. And finally, there should be policies, guidelines, and processes to ensure that inclusivity is on a continuum of progress and standardization. This is a nice infographic that Damon created for us that visualizes the test inclusivity as an adventurous journey. We want to consider all test takers as individuals with diverse needs and backgrounds. We want to consider impact. We want to use a global English that is reflective of English as it is now as an international language, and it should be in keeping of our test takers and learners' diverse realities. So let's talk about what we do a little bit for inclusive test design at the British Council. Our philosophy at the British Council is to focus on the social model rather than the medical model. We mainstream EDI into our processes and products at every stage. This is what we call EDI by design. And how do we do this? Well, we need to use planning tools and inclusion guides, and we monitor our targets continually. As an example, this is our inclusion guide for test content creation. Please do scan the QR code as it has many practical tips for test content creation that can be applied to both standardized assessment and classroom content. Within the guide, you will find that it is organized by types of test content, such as audio, text, and images. And the guidance considers these three umbrella categories listed: group representation, privilege balance, and sociocultural inclusion. This guide is meant to be applicable to any context and any test, and it's not particular to British Council products, so I hope it can be helpful for you if you are looking for a guide for your own context and content creation or selection. Inside this same guide, we have chosen minimum percentages for global English accent inclusion for our listening test audio content. We use professional actors and record our audios in a studio. And after the implementation of this new policy, we began to include other accents, such as European, Asian, and South American varieties. Within the policy, there is a thorough section that is based on research, which was written in large part by our colleague and listening specialist, Cheryl Cook. And it talks about comprehensibility being the focus, rather than using native or standard accents. As comprehensibility is the goal for all learners of English, the accents that we include in our tests are highly comprehensible and they're not strong. As you can see on the right, in recent recordings, we have been meeting the targets set by the policy. Firstly, to better represent our test taker population, and secondly, with a larger social impact in mind, to impact classroom teaching and learning with the intention that teachers will better familiarize learners using a variety of English accents that people may encounter in the real world after the test. And I'll be talking a bit more about accents and what our test takers think a bit later in the webinar. So now I'd like to ask all of you a question about your own test content or learning content and how you choose it. So you can see the options that come up. What content do you use for classroom learning and/or assessments? 1, I choose standard content that matches the test and/or curriculum within my context. 2, I choose standard content and also include some other content that is familiar for my context, maybe from teacher training or school resources. 3, I choose content from a diverse range of sources and contexts, even outside of the test and/or curriculum. Or I don't choose content as I am assigned textbooks and resources by management. And 5, I don't choose content as I don't teach or assess, maybe work in other related fields. So I see we have 35 responses so far. And so far, the majority do choose content from a diverse range of sources and contexts, even outside of the test and/or curriculum. Really happy to see that. Great. Of course, some people aren't choosing their own content. That's completely normal. 43 responses, still a majority. That's fantastic. That's great. Okay. So now I will be handing over to Nahal, who will be speaking about her research on diversifying content.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and many thanks to Gemma and the team at the British Council for inviting me here today. So I'll be talking today about tests and representation. And often when we think about tests, we usually think about scores, we think about rankings and criteria, we think about accuracy, reliability. Hopefully, we think about fairness. So we tend to focus more on how well the test judge performance. But I would like to argue today that tests also do something quieter and a lot more subtle and perhaps more invisible. They teach and they reflect particular ways of seeing the world. And this is what we're talking about today about the hidden curriculum. Next slide, please, Gemma. Thank you. So I'd like to talk to you today about seeing tests not as just these objective things that we use to look at performance, but as cultural artifacts. So the texts, the images, the tasks that we see inside tests, they're not just assessing language, but very much like textbooks that you're familiar with, they are cultural artifacts in the sense that they carry values, they carry assumptions and perspectives which are shaped by the people, places, and the institutions that produce them. As Wenninger reminds us, meaning doesn't just reside in isolated words or in pictures. Rather, it emerges from how texts and images work together, and he highlights particularly the idea of inference as action. And I think what this means is that we're not just passive receivers of the meaning that is represented to us, but that readers or test takers or learners, that we actively interpret what we see, we make connections, we draw conclusions, and we bring our own experiences to the representation that is presented to us. So take the illustration here that we've got on the slide. This is actually taken from a textbook, and the language point that they were trying to teach, as you might be able to see, it's a bit small. I apologize. It says the richest man in the world was probably the Emir of Kuwait, blah blah blah. And the illustration, actually, the teaching point of this illustration was about teaching superlatives, the richest man. But what is represented here is that it's become perhaps a lot more reinforced by the image that is going with the text. It's an Arab man driving a truck full of money, and therefore the image combined with the text, it reinforces familiar associations, perhaps to do with wealth, power, oil, and even perhaps masculinity. And depending, so this is what we meant, Wenninger means by meaning as representation. But also, depending on your background, the inferences that you draw on this picture and on the text may be different. So for some, this can just be a language exercise. Oh, it's just teaching superlatives. For others, it may recognize a particular stereotypes about Arabs and oil wealth. And for some, they might feel that the portrayal is perhaps too exaggerated, or perhaps it's too culturally narrow. And once we start viewing learning and assessment materials as cultural artifacts, these patterns become a lot easier to see. We noticed which ways of living are centered, which ways are absent, and whose realities are made visible, and whose realities are perhaps not and are invisible. So in my talk today, we'll be looking a little bit at some of the research examining how English learning materials, actually a lot of the research is based on textbooks, but also some language tests. So we'll be looking at generally learning and assessment materials and how these cultural artifacts represent the world, the values that they embed, and the implications of some of the choices that have been made in terms of this representation. Next slide, please, Gemma. Thank you. So thinking about the politics of language education doesn't really happen in a vacuum. What appears, what we see in textbook and texts and curricula, as Carol Chappell says, it is very much shaped by political, ideological, and economic forces. So what the research in English language testing and teaching has shown is that these choices actually contribute to a hidden curriculum that can reinforce certain norms and perhaps certain social hierarchies. And we see that there has been quite a strong movement within the English language teaching, but also within the in the field of language testing, within the critical language testing movement. This trend has been picked up by shifting attention from the psychometric qualities of tests to more towards the social aspects of testing. So thinking a little bit more about the social consequences of testing, who is benefiting, who is being disadvantaged, what kind of worlds are assessments promoting? And this is really what we'll be focusing on today. So but if we think about language education this way, we can think about tests not as just technical practices, but things that are deeply social and political. And within this broader understanding of language education as socially and politically shaped, then we can start maybe asking questions, more pointed questions about what exactly is being represented. And when we're looking at the research, there's been a whole line of research looking at different areas of representation. So this can be representation of culture, it can be representation of gender and sexuality, representation of race. There has been work looking at representation of people with disabilities, language varieties and accent. This is something that Gemma will be talking about a little bit more later on, a representation of class and socioeconomic status. And there's also been some research looking at representation of global citizenship and what that might look like. So these are just some of the many different ways that we can look, or different perspectives that we can take when we're engaging with these different assessment materials. And in my talk today, I'll be looking at the first three of them in green. So looking at culture, gender, sexuality, and race, and looking at some of the research that has been looking at these aspects and maybe helping us think a little bit more about questions that we need to be asking. So first, thinking about focusing on culture, there's one bit of research that I particularly like. This has been done by Fremeth in two bits of research, 2013 and 2016. And what this researcher had done, she looked at 20 reading tests, and this is actually taken from very much from a language assessment perspective, 20 reading tests from a high-stakes language test. And what she did was she took the reading text and then she did what we call a cultural content analysis. So looking at things like historical references, particular artifacts that might be historical or cultural that were noted, that were referenced in the textbooks, and these were all coded. And what she did is then she started counting all the different texts and how many cultural content codes there were. And what they found is that in every single reading test, there were at least about 13 different cultural references. And for the Emirati higher education setting that she was looking at, these cultural references were outside the experience of the students most of the students that she was working with. And they had very little background knowledge of some of the ideas that were presented in this reading text. Which led her to say, so, why are these there? And if they are outside of the experience of these test takers, and what does that mean about test fairness? And then started that, what are the implications of these for test takers? In a follow-up study, she also looked at the perceptions of the students, of the UAE students, and again, they were, sorry, Gemma, just one point about the previous one, that a student was actually really concerned about the Western focus of the test and how it might be culturally biased, and it might introduce unfamiliar notions to them. Thank you. So the question that then we could be asking is actually whose culture is being foregrounded. And if we look at other research that has been done in this area, Jenkins and Lung, for example, they say that if we're looking at, again, high-stakes international tests, mainly American or British culture is being foregrounded. The social conventions, idiomatic language or locations that are used in international tests, these are, again, most leaning towards American or British culture, and this therefore may disadvantage those we don't have a deep knowledge of these culture. They don't have enough knowledge of these cultures. The work in the context of Oman, Al-Isa argued cultural insensitivity of international test, perhaps with colonialist or culturalist ideology and bias, again, in representing unfamiliar concepts in the particular context or Omani context that they were looking at. And again, Nouri and Mir Hosseini, these are colleagues in Iran who were, again, they looked at reading, listening, speaking, and writing text, a series of texts, again, another international high-stakes test. And what they said is that they view certain ideological orientations that they viewed as associated with capitalism, globalization, more Western cultures. And therefore, what they said, if a test is labeled international, we can problematize this because they're still being taken by people around the world. And could we call a test international if it has very specific ideological orientations? So it could be biased and it could be value laden. So I think on the one hand, this is actually, it is very, we can also, this is very strong research suggesting this, but then a very important question comes out, which takes us to the next slide and something where we'd like to perhaps ask your question about, which is, then whose or which values should be represented in an international test or in a local test? And again, when we're thinking of local, you might even say, what is local? Who's local? So we would really like to hear from you. If you would put your ideas in the chat, we'd like to hear what your views are about this. Yeah, some say linguistic imperialism might also be presented in tests. Yeah, some of the things that, yes, this has been definitely picked up in the research. Any other ideas? So if we have problems, or if we think this is of concern, what could be suggestions about going forward? And I ask this without actually having an answer to this. I think this is an extremely complicated question. Okay, so one attendee says the global south in its dynamic sense deserves more space in global tests. Okay, another colleague, somebody I recognize, that the target test context and population should be considered and addressed, probably through a needs analysis. Yes, so we can think about consulting with different stakeholders and understanding what their views are before putting them in a test. One attendee is saying we need to be, there should be more awareness of this, but also isn't learning about language also learning about the culture? But again, I would ask you, whose culture? Even in a local context, we might have multiple cultures. Some argue that we should have different versions of a test, perhaps localized. That non-mainstream communities should be represented. Some people say it's very tricky. It needs to be multifaceted. Yep. But also that certain ways of teaching or learning is divorced from the everyday realities of the learners. These are all extremely good points. And I think these are the voices that we need to be. I mean, we can talk about this for the whole day, frankly, because this is something that I think both Gemma and I are extremely interested in. So is a lot, but it's just what all of you have pointed out is that there's a lot of complexities here, and it's not a straightforward answer. So we still need to make whatever we choose to put on a test, it says something about our values. And we just need to be sure that there's transparency and that their different voices are being heard before we make these choices. Is it okay if we move on, Gemma? As much as I would love to continue talking about this. The next bit that I'd like to talk about is a little bit about representation, about some of the research on gender and sexuality. So one of a very strong study, and for anybody who's interested in that, I would really urge you to go look at what Kelesh, Mansouri, and Yazan have done 2023. What they looked is that they looked at the New Headway, this is based on textbook analysis, the New Headway textbook series. And what they did is they looked at it temporally over 26 years. They looked at gender representation. And what they found is that, so they looked at both what the visuals and the images that had been shown, but also what the text that went with the visuals. So again, like a multimodal analysis of the text and the images. And what they found is that the visuals very much, very strongly relied on traditional roles and traditional patterns. So women were heavily underrepresented. There were indications of bias in all places. Women were much more associated with the household. Men were more associated with business. And the spaces that men and women occupied, again, there was a very strong contrast between. And again, women were much more aligned with spaces that were at home, with childcare, or in learning environments such as schools, whereas men were actually occupied many different spaces, particularly business and professional. Women were more associated with learning languages, for example, whereas men were associated with the STEM subjects, women with arts, men with sports. And these were just very much dichotomous representations that were they saw in the textbooks over time. What they did see is that because they looked at this temporally, representations increased over time, but this was still very much built on heteronormative norms and binaries. So they looked at this particular textbook, but this line of research and the findings that they have is very much seen in a lot of other work. So not just international textbooks, but work that has been done in Indonesia, for example, in Hong Kong, with textbooks that are locally produced, as well as more international textbooks, that there has definitely been a sort of traditional visuals associated with more traditional roles and patterns. So this is, we see this all the time. And there's something that has come up which is much more relevant to thinking about tests. And this is a study that one of my colleagues and I did, and with looking at talking to examiners in an international test. And one of the examiners pointed out that especially when you're talking to students or learners from lower levels of proficiency, and you ask them a question which says, for example, do you think boys are better at sports than girls, or do you think boys are better at math than girls? That first of all, the question implies that one is better than the other, but it's also thinking about the link to language proficiency. It's a lot harder for someone with low confidence or weaker skills to assert themselves, to say, why should one be better than the other? Or I don't like the way question is phrased, and also with the power dynamics with an examiner, that to question something that is obviously value laden and has perhaps some bias in it, even inadvertently, becomes a lot more difficult when you're speaking in your second language and you don't have a high enough language proficiency. So that becomes even a more complicated scenario as well. And the other thing, thinking about that, the other research that came out of here is that when gender is only binary. So when we looked at gender, there were binary approaches to gender as the pervasive discourse, again, reinforcing heteronormativity. In Gray's work, they talk about a blanket avoidance of any representation of clearly identified LGBT characters. And also Selby and Korteman, again, in another study, they show that there's a tendency to bolster dichotomous juxtaposition of genders and sexualities, thinking about essentialized ways of being and becoming. So basically, very few, pretty much non-existent LGBTQ plus representations. And this really makes it so one might ask, well, why would we need to have LGBTQ plus representation in textbooks? We're teaching them language. And this is, again, there's a lot of conversation that is going on around this. But what is that this goes beyond words or beyond teaching of grammar and vocabulary. This is about the power of representation for our learners. So Bolas, drawing on Judith Butler's gender performativity theory, argues that when you don't have the absence of minority references in learning and test materials, actually deprives the learners of assuming, let alone performing, their own identities and whatever different background of identities that they might be bringing. It can impact on their motivation, but also in a positive sense, that if they feel that they are represented, that it can help motivation, promote engagement, and promote self-efficacy. And also, let's not forget our overarching aims of fairness and justice for all learners. And the last bit of the research that I'll be looking at is a little bit of representation focusing on race. And again, a very research that's quite telling, as a bit of research done by Bowen and Hopper in 2023, fairly recent research. What they did is they looked at the idea of inclusivity of race. They took 5 popular textbooks, and they were particularly interested again in image representation. There are 1,648 images that they took from these textbooks, and they divided it. And again, I mean, if you're interested, you can go and see how, for example, how they defined race, how they went about doing it. All of them complicated questions, but they had a few categories. So they had white, they had black, Asian, and other. What they found is that whites were significantly overrepresented. If you see in the pie chart, they're about 68% of the images, or 68% whites. They were taking up the majority of the physical space on the textbooks. So in the page, they took more space than the other races, and that the large proportion of Black and other image participants were used to increase social engagement with the viewer. They were smiling more, they had more direct gaze with the viewer. So this is again some of the ways in which they had coded their images. And going to the next page, this raised important questions, a bit of food for thought. So if we think, so whites are significantly overrepresented, what does that actually mean? Is it because most English speakers or learners in the world are white? And this is knowing that the estimated East Asian population learning English is close to 400 million. So severely underrepresented, clearly very severely underrepresented in these textbooks. Are these textbooks mirroring country demographics? Again, something we can go back and check. I have talked to people in the UK, and they definitely think that there are certain demographics are severely, again, underrepresented in textbooks. And the other, again, a more nuanced questions, are Blacks and the other image participants in this study, are they the relatable ones? Are the whites the more default experts? Are these image reinforcing underlying hierarchies of power and status? Again, very perhaps difficult questions to respond, but also a lot of food for thought for all of us. And again, at the end of their article, Bowen and Hopper, what they say is that a lack of inclusivity can lead to passive or transmissive rather than active or transactional modes of learning. Adequate inclusivity can foster awareness and understanding of diversity of self and others, which in turn can help to combat prejudices, stereotypes, and other often implicit biases. And I think what we see here is that sometimes we might be teaching language, we might be teaching it, but also this is an opportunity for thinking about having better citizens of the world, and this should not be a lost opportunity. And we can do this in our textbooks, we can do this in our interactions in our classrooms, and we can do this certainly in our tests as well. And thinking about how we as educators or as test designers, how we can take representation forward, I think the most important thing is once you have these goggles on, you can try to apply the critical lens to the materials that you work with. We can start challenging stereotypes. We can start asking who is missing. We can start thinking about diversifying materials and thinking about opening up the discussion and the dialogue and making sure that we empower our students. And this is, I'm sure that you all have many different ways that we can bring in our students and make sure that we create more positive and inclusive environments. And this is just a few. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you so much, Nahal. Wow, I've heard a bit of this before, last year, your research, but again, it's just blowing my mind, and I'm just so grateful that you joined us today, because these are such important topics and such important work that teachers can do to diversify their materials in the classroom. So taking a sidestep away from mostly image work back to accents, although as I mentioned before, our inclusion guide does cover different variety of input for our test content, and it does talk about images as well. Today, I'll just be talking about a couple case studies that followed up on the accent inclusion in our tests. So the first, when we began to include accents other than British or American varieties, it was important to understand what our test takers thought of this. So I conducted a study in 2021, shortly after the implementation of our new test content policy. And this study asked test takers of the Foundation English test for their opinions on accent inclusion. The majority of the 729 test takers who took the test during a pilot trial responded positively to the first question, do you like to hear different accents in the listening test? With 61% saying yes. 18% did not have a preference and 20% said no. An open-ended question about comments resulted in 286 valid responses, which were coded and recoded into many categories that fit under or into three umbrella categories: positive, negative, and ambiguous or opinion, which I'll just briefly talk to today. The other categories, if you want to hear more, please get in contact. So these comments again showed a majority of positive commentary, including many comments that spoke to the validity of accent inclusion, such as this allows candidates to understand when they go out there and start working. Other comments showed that test takers still preferred standard accents for reasons of difficulty and familiarity, and some test takers didn't notice or gave suggestions, which were taken on board internally. So the second case study on accent inclusion, this was carried out by my colleague Petra Smelek, and this is for a recent study for her MA in language testing at Lancaster this year. And this time, we asked our Aptis General test takers what they thought of accent inclusion. So Petra also looked at the impact of scores for her study, but today I'll present you her data that she found on test takers' opinions. Again, when asked about whether they like to hear different accents, a majority agreed, and about 20% said no, and 17.4% didn't have a preference. So this was very, very similar numbers to the previous study 4 years ago. Then, when Petra analyzed the commentary, she found again a higher majority of test takers to be quite positive about the approach, while around 18% still preferred standard accents, and 19% did not notice or didn't have an opinion either way. So both of these impact case studies show us that the majority of our test takers appreciate an inclusive approach to accent diversity in our standardized international tests. This is evidence of consequential validity, as I mentioned earlier with the sociocognitive approach. We're listening to our stakeholders. They are at the center of test validation, and we must consider and continue to consider their diverse needs and their expectations of learning and assessment. So now let's take a step back and talk a bit about test design versus test content and application in the classroom. And we'll first clarify some differences. So test content is what we assess. It's the knowledge, the skills, the topic, and we use task prompts, images, and audios as input, for example. Test design and format, meanwhile, is how we assess. So that includes the mode or component, that is written, spoken, video, visual, and also timing, sensory channels, environmental conditions, and task types and task response formats. This difference really matters because the design can shape or distort the learner's ability to show what they actually know and the language they can produce with the task type. The content can also have a huge effect on the learner's ability to produce language and must also be taken into account, as Nahal was just explaining. So both are especially important for equity. Design and content can increase and or reduce barriers for test takers. When we design classroom assessments, several variables shape whether learners have the same fair experience. If you consider cognitive load theory from Sweller, this helps us understand what happens when learners process assessment tasks. He distinguishes between intrinsic load, that's the inherent difficulty of the content, and extraneous load, that's difficulty created by potentially poor design, and germane load, the load that supports learning. Multimodal design can reduce extraneous load, for example, providing visuals that help clarify the meaning, but it can also increase load if too many modalities compete for attention. In another study in 2022, Lee and colleagues found that multimodal inputs helped students in immediate vocabulary tests, but the delayed performance was actually more complex. The added modes increased demands for some learners, particularly when working memory was already stretched. So the implication for classroom assessment is that multimodality within tasks isn't inherently better or more equitable. Actually, the key is intentional design. So we need to think about how learners will actually process the task and how to give them enough time and scaffolding to manage the cognitive demands. So we need to consider multimodal response opportunities. Can students respond through speaking, writing, or with visuals? This matters because learners do have different strengths and a single mode may exclude some. Then processing time. So this includes timed versus untimed tasks, as well as planning or rehearsal time. Some learners need longer to process written language or to organize ideas. Then sensory access and environment. Consider the audio quality, lighting, background noise, whether assistive technology is available. A listening test with poor audio, for example, becomes a test of hearing and not of language. Then language-bearing load. This is the amount of reading or vocabulary needed just to understand the task. So this can be reduced with some scaffolding and also simple language. Then assessment flexibility. We do sometimes need to offer alternatives depending on what the diverse test takers' needs are. So what does all this mean for practice? We'll consider some implications and some recommendations. First, design does matter for fairness. Two learners with equal understanding may perform differently purely because of the mode or time pressure, audio quality, or environmental distractions. Secondly, access issues must be treated as part of the test design and not as an afterthought. Processing time, as well as sensory and language load, are structural components of assessment and not learner deficits. Then content design alignment is essential. If the design creates barriers unrelated to the learning outcome, then validity is actually compromised. So practical recommendations: review your test content. Is it appropriate? Is it relevant? Review the design. Could students respond in more than one mode? Is the time adequate? Assess cognitive load, remove unnecessary complexity, and offer planning and pausing time. And then use alternative modes such as writing or video where appropriate, while of course keeping the criteria equivalent. And then finally, monitor student performance. If certain individuals or groups struggle due to design-related issues, then the next cycle should be adapted accordingly. So in short, thoughtful test design supports inclusion, fairness, and accurate measurement of what learners truly know. And we have some references from both my accent part and Damon's cognitive and multimodal section. And now we'll be open for some questions. I think we have about 10 minutes. So please do pop your questions into the Q&A if you haven't already. And Nahal will be joining me. There she is. Okay, so I see a very interesting question coming up here already. Doesn't it all depend on the purpose of a test? If it's to do with British or American university entry exams, then it may be a requirement to know about the culture. Oh, I see you smiling, Nahal. Do you want to go ahead and take that first? I can.
No, I'm happy for you to have a go, and then I can chip in as well. So it's up to you.
I'm sure we're going to agree on this, but yes, My initial reaction is that even if you're going to a British or American university, you're going to be speaking and getting to know people from many, many different cultures with different backgrounds. And I mean, accents is a great example here, very easy one. You're going to encounter many different accents. So being limited to a British or American accent in an international test, even if it is for a British or American university, can be limiting. But on the other hand, the first part of the question, doesn't it all depend on the purpose of a test? Absolutely, of course. You need to consider the context of use. And I'll let you pick up. Nahal, please do.
No, I agree, but also, what is British culture? What is American culture? There are, I'm sure there are very different interpretations of even what that means. And the idea here is that we just need to be aware that when we're talking about something like British culture, we don't necessarily all mean the same. And that there maybe has been reasons why a particular version of it is the one that we recognize. And again, to think a little bit about the power behind that and trying to just engage a bit more critically with it. But going back to the original, what you said at the beginning is, yes, the purpose of the test should be the driving force, but we should just make sure we're aware of the fact that there's still these tests, or whether they're still produced by people coming from certain backgrounds, and we just need to make sure it's inclusive. That's what I would say.
Absolutely. I think what you said earlier about values is just so important here as well, because culture is such a huge topic,
Mm,
and encouraging certain stereotypes may be positive or negative. But if we're
mm,
encouraging positive values, then
yeah.
and yeah, then that's of course what we want to do as a British organization. The British Council does want to
Mm.
encourage positive British values, but not perpetrate negative stereotypes within content. And I'm just seeing some more pop up here. Okay. Accents are one of the biggest issues for the test takers. The issue is most of them are trained with a standard global accent, mostly standardized American, but in a popular test such as IELTS, they have to do the listening section in British ones, which imposes a challenging obstacle to them. Well, the research is there's a vast amount of research on accent familiarity, and it does show that the more familiar you are, the easier it will be to understand an accent. What we do with our accents for our tests is make sure that they are highly comprehensible, so we're not introducing more difficulty. But you also need to consider the washback or the consequences of inclusion of different accents in tests. And that is actually with the hope that learners will become more familiar with other accents, as they will encounter different accents in the real world. So, Nahal, do you want to add to that? You're an
I mean,
IELTS expert.
not definitely not on the listening side, but I think that's what the research also suggests, and that it's again one of those difficult considerations of, how do you balance wanting to represent different accents, with the fact that then you could, it takes, I think takes time to tune in to different accents as well. So there's like a research done on the cognitive side, but that I think what Gemma said is the yeah, I think I'm gonna go with your response, Gemma, on this because I haven't done as much of the research on accents.
Yes, well, the thing is that actually a lot of the research shows that there might be a little bit more, a little bit of difficulty that leads to a slightly lower score, but actually it doesn't impact the score enough to be a conclusive argument not to use them.
Yeah.
Of course, if they're very, very strong accents, that does increase difficulty. But what the research shows is that the inclusion of different accents doesn't have a massive impact on scores.
Yeah. I think what I remember from some of the research I read is that you there's a little bit of time it takes I don't know 30 seconds or so for you to tune into to an accent, and once you have that, so the main thing is that the test should not include questions about the first 30 seconds. So you just leave that for the
Absolutely.
tuning in, and then you start asking the questions that refer to the actual text, and that's how you try and balance that out in case anybody is unfamiliar. Am I correct in that, Gemma? That's what I remember.
I think I agree. It's best practices to have some lead-in time no matter what the accent is, because it actually we need to activate our processing, our listening processing, and so much of listening processing is contextual. So if you're in a listening exam, you have zero context to guess what you're about to hear. So we need a little bit more time to understand what's actually going on in the audio while we process. So. Yeah, agreed. I have one that is maybe slightly more for you. So I've noticed that the inclusion of non-mainstream communities, e.g. from the global south, in textbooks and tests is usually stereotyped. Most of the time, teachers do not have another choice other than use this material. How could we raise awareness of this issue among students?
I mean, I haven't really, I haven't been a teacher in a very long time, so I think I'm going to trust the educators who are here more than what I would say. But having an open dialogue about it is a good starting point. So you ask the students what they think about this representation, and what would they do if, they from their own community, how would they think about representations in their own community? So even if you are stuck with a particular textbook, it doesn't mean that you cannot have the conversation about it. And I think that's where we can start. Gemma, what would you think?
Completely agree. Absolutely. I think this is where localized teaching comes into play. Teachers know their students better than anybody else, and there's probably not a single rule of thumb that works to raise awareness, but open dialogue is absolutely key to opening minds, and pointing it out, right? If you see some
Yeah.
stereotypes that aren't positive, then maybe don't ignore them, bring them up and have that conversation. Great. Okay, so I have a question about English is already a lingua franca in many parts of the world. If not L1, it is L2 in many countries. The issues is where it would be used. If used locally, it can be localized or global, but when migrating to an L1 country of English, different dynamics come into play around culture and idiomatic nuances. I guess that's more of a comment.
Yeah.
Want to say anything to that?
No, I agree in the sense that we're first of all, like I think we're all in this, that that English is not does not belong to a particular group of people, that it has become lingua franca, it is more global. But I guess what we're trying to say is that there's the materials, for example, that are based the materials that we use may not necessarily have those values in place. And so what we're trying to say here is not that we're like against English as lingua franca, but rather that we should, when we're engaging with these materials, which is the thing, try to broaden the cultural frameworks that we're operating under. If that makes any sense. But I am not disagreeing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with this. Yeah, I agree with the comment.
I guess the last line, different dynamics come into play around culture and idiomatic nuances. In the recent study I did with teachers here in Belgium, and my publications coming out, had to get that in there. But
Yes.
there was a very interesting comment from one of the teachers saying that it's unfair to always put the pressure on the L2 speaker. The L1 speaker also has to understand where they're coming from, and what they might not be understanding, and what their background is. If there's some nuanced cultural thing at play here, then we as L1 speakers can bring them in and to that and explain and help them through something that they might not be aware of. So it's a two-way
really like
street
that.
here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I really like
I
that.
think
It's a
we're
good.
yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a bit unfair when you're juggling multiple languages to have all the pressure on you, right?
Yeah.
We should be a more inclusive culture. Okay, so I think we can do one last question before we wrap up. So you mentioned that you could easily omit a skill if the test was split into different skills, for example, listening. Will renowned institutes make such amends, and will this be accepted by higher education institutes? What's your experience?
I
So
think
this
this is
is
one for you, Gemma.
okay, well, you're working at a higher education institute, but sure. Aptis is split into different skills so that it's very easy to have an exemption. And we also have many varieties of certain skills so that they can be taken, for example, visually impaired. We have speaking tests with pictures. If you are visually impaired, that shouldn't be part of the test, and it's unfair to have you describe a picture. So we have different versions of the test so that it is just targeting speaking and not dependent on the input. I hope that other institutes are making these choices and are allowing test takers to have exemptions because it's it's a huge risk when you're using integrated skills, tasks, and tests that many people are being excluded.
Mm.
Okay. All right. Well, that wraps up our questions. So we will move on. Thank you everybody so much for your questions. Really appreciate them. And thank you so much, Nahal, for your input. It's so great to have you here. Okay, so we will wrap up with some key ideas. Firstly, your test design and context, very important. You need to consider cognitive load also when targeting a specific skill. Policies and guidelines, you can always develop and formalize your own policies. Take the British Council one, take the bits that are relevant for you, or start from scratch. Remember that you'll need to continually train people who are involved in learning and assessment and prepare learners with inclusivity in mind. Then evaluation. Remember to not only embed EDI principles from the beginning, but to continue to evaluate the content and also the learner's needs for improvement and get their opinions on what's working and what's not. And upcoming, we have the third webinar. This will be in February 2026. So in a couple of months, this will conclude our trilogy of EDI and assessment webinars. Please do fill in the feedback survey. We learn a lot from it. So the link will be in the chat. And thank you so much to Nahal again for joining us today. And thank you so very much to the New Directions team, especially Anna and Neil, for all your background organizing and support. Thank you so much to all the participants who joined us today as well, especially, and we hope that you'll join the third webinar in February. Stay tuned for further details, and goodbye for now.
Bye and thank you.